The alarm screamed through the colony like a wounded animal, and every living creature on Caro 7 knew exactly what it meant. Commander Desic of the Vorn Confederacy stood in the control room, his forearms trembling as he watched the sensor display. And for the first time in his 200 years of life, he felt the cold touch of absolute terror wrap around his heart. A Bloodfang had been spotted in the Northern Highlands. The word spread through the mining colony like fire through dry grass. And within minutes, the streets were filled with screaming colonists, all of them running toward the evacuation ships, all of them leaving behind everything they owned, because nothing they owned was worth dying for. The Bloodfang was the nightmare that every species in the Galactic Union shared, the one monster that united all of them in fear. And for good reason. It stood 9 feet tall when it walked on its hind legs, and its body was covered in armor made of black chitin that could stop plasma fire, and its claws could tear through starship hulls like paper, and its eyes glowed with a terrible crimson light that pulsed brighter. Just before it killed, 12 star systems had been abandoned because of the Bloodfang, and 3 entire species had been wiped from existence. And in 400 years of recorded history, no one had ever killed one without orbital bombardment. The old story said that the Bloodfang did not hunt for food, because it did not need to eat, and it did not hunt for territory, because it did not need a home, and the only reason it killed was because killing was what it was made to do. Commander Desic gave the evacuation order, and the colonists obeyed without question, because every child in the galaxy grew up hearing the stories, and every adult knew that the stories were true. But there was a problem. Sector 7 had gone silent 3 hours ago, when a mining shaft collapsed, and the communication relay had been destroyed in the accident, and 3 Kalari miners were trapped somewhere in the wreckage with injuries that needed immediate treatment. The rescue team had been preparing to go when the Bloodfang alert sounded. And now the rescue team was running toward the evacuation ships like everyone else. And no one was going to Sector 7. No one except Dr. Elena Vance. Elena was a human, one of only 12 humans on Caro 7, and she had been working as a field medic at the colony for 2 years. And in those 2 years, she had earned a reputation for being stubborn in ways that made the other species nervous. She stood in the medical bay, packing her emergency kit, while the alarm screamed and the lights flashed red. And her assistant, a young Mathene named Pollux, watched her with wide golden eyes that were filled with disbelief. Dr. Vance. "You cannot go to Sector 7, Pollux said, his voice high and thin with fear. "The Bloodfang is in the Northern Highlands, and Sector 7 is in the Northern Highlands. And if you go there, you will die." Elena did not stop packing, and she did not look up. And her hands moved with the steady calm of someone who had made difficult decisions before and would make them again. "3 people are hurt and alone out there," she said. "I am not leaving them behind. But the Bloodfang has not killed anyone yet," Elena said, finally looking at her assistant. "And those 3 miners will definitely die if someone does not treat their injuries. So right now, the miners are the more immediate problem." Pollux made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a prayer, and he watched as Elena lifted her medical bag onto her shoulder and walked toward the door. And he knew that there was nothing he could say that would stop her. This was the thing about humans that the other species never quite understood. They were small and soft, and they had no natural weapons. And their planet was a death world filled with predators and poison and disasters. And somehow they had survived all of it. And the survival had made them into something strange. Humans did not run from danger the way other species did. And they did not freeze in fear the way other species did. And instead, they looked at danger and made calculations and decided what they were willing to risk. Elena had made her calculation, and she was willing to risk everything. She took a medical transport and flew north through the fog that always covered Caro 7. And the colony grew smaller behind her, and the emergency broadcast grew fainter. And soon she was alone in the gray mist with nothing but the sound of her own breathing. The crash site was worse than she had expected. The mining shaft had collapsed completely, and the wreckage was spread across half a kilometer. And the fog made everything look like a graveyard made of twisted metal and broken stone. Elena landed her transport and grabbed her medical bag and began searching through the wreckage, calling out for survivors. Listening for any response, she found them 20 minutes later. 3 Kalari miners were huddled in a small shelter they had made from fallen beams, and 2 of them were unconscious, and the third was barely awake. And all of them were bleeding from wounds that needed immediate attention. "Help is here," Elena said, crawling into the shelter and beginning to assess the injuries. "I am going to get you out of here." The conscious Kalari, a young female with pale blue skin, looked at Elena with eyes that were glazed with pain and shock. "Human," she whispered. "You should not be here," the alert said. "I know what the alert said," Elena replied. "Already working on the worst of the wounds, but I am a doctor, and you need help. And that is all that matters right now." She worked quickly and efficiently, stabilizing the injuries, stopping the bleeding, doing everything she could with the limited supply she had. And she was so focused on her work that she almost did not notice when the fog around the shelter began to change. The temperature dropped, and the mist grew thicker, and somewhere in the distance there was a sound like thunder. Except it was not thunder, it was something breathing. Elena looked up, and her hands went still, and her heart stopped beating for just a moment. The Bloodfang was standing 30 meters away, watching her with eyes that burned like dying stars. It was bigger than the story said, and more terrible than the picture showed, and its black armor gleamed with moisture from the fog, and the crimson veins that ran beneath its chitin pulsed with a slow and steady rhythm. Elena could not move, and she could not breathe, and she could not think. And for one long, terrible moment, she was certain that she was about to die. But then she noticed something that the fear had almost made her miss. The Bloodfang was not standing properly, and one of its massive legs was twisted at an angle that was not natural. And there was something dark and wet pooling on the ground. Beneath it, the monster was injured. The creature that had terrorized the galaxy for 400 years was hurt and bleeding, and it had collapsed against a rock formation. And it was looking at her with eyes that held something she had never expected to see: pain. The Bloodfang was in pain, and it was dying. And Elena realized with sudden terrible clarity that she was going to have to make a choice. She could stay hidden and wait for the creature to die, or she could run and hope it was too weak to chase her, or she could do the one thing that no one in the history of the galaxy had ever done. She could try to help it. Her hands began reaching for her medical bag before her mind had finished making the decision. And somewhere deep inside her soul, Elena Vance knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The Bloodfang did not move, and Elena did not move. And for a long moment, the only sound was the soft dripping of dark ichor onto stone. Elena's mind was racing with thoughts that fought against each other like animals trapped in a cage. And every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, to hide, to get as far away from this creature as possible. But her eyes kept returning to the wound. A jagged piece of mining equipment had punched through the gap between the creature's armor plates, and the metal was buried deep in what she assumed was muscle. And the ichor that pooled beneath, it was thick and dark, and coming out much too fast. The Bloodfang was dying, and it knew it was dying. And there was something in its crimson eyes that looked almost like resignation behind her. In the shelter, the conscious Kalari miner made a sound of pure terror. "Human," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "Human, we must go. We must leave now." Do you not understand what that thing is? Elena understood. And that was the problem. She understood that this creature had killed millions. And she understood that entire worlds had burned because of it. And she understood that every species in the galaxy would call her insane for what she was thinking. But she also understood that she was a doctor. And doctors did not let things die if they could help it. "I know what it is," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I know what I am." She stood up slowly, keeping her movements careful and visible. And she stepped out of the shelter and into the open ground between herself and the Bloodfang. The creature's eyes tracked her movement, and its massive claws twitched against the stone. And a low rumbling sound came from somewhere deep in its chest. Elena stopped walking and held up her hands, showing that they were empty, showing that she was not a threat. "I am not going to hurt you," she said, speaking slowly and clearly. "I can see that you are injured, and I want to help. But I need you to understand that I am not your enemy." The Bloodfang made another sound, deeper and more dangerous than before, and its eyes pulsed brighter red. Elena did not run. "I know you can hurt me," she said. "I know you can kill me before I even see you move. But I also know that if someone does not treat that wound, you are going to bleed out in the next few hours. And I do not want that to happen." The creature tilted its massive head, and for a moment, Elena felt like she was being studied, measured, evaluated by an intelligence far older and stranger than anything she had encountered before behind her. The Kalari miner was crying now, begging Elena to come back, telling her stories about what the Bloodfang had done, reciting the names of worlds that had been destroyed, listing the species that had been erased from existence. Elena listened to all of it, and she did not turn around. And she did not stop walking. She crossed the distance between herself and the creature one slow step at a time. And with each step, the Bloodfang watched her. And with each step, the tension in the air grew thicker. And with each step, Elena became more certain that she was either doing the bravest thing anyone had ever done, or the stupidest thing anyone had ever done. When she was close enough to touch the creature, she stopped and knelt down beside the wound. The Bloodfang's claws were close enough to take her head off, and its eyes were burning with that terrible crimson light, and its breathing was labored and wet and filled with pain. Elena looked at the wound and began assessing it the same way she would assess any wound. And she spoke out loud as she worked, explaining what she was seeing and what she was going to do. "The metal has punctured through the muscle layer, and it is very close to what I think is a major blood vessel. And I need to remove it and seal the wound before you lose any more ichor. Do you understand what I am saying?" The Bloodfang made a sound that might have been a growl or might have been a word, and Elena chose to interpret it as agreement. She opened her medical bag and began pulling out supplies, and her hands were shaking now, but she forced them to steady as she prepared to do something that no doctor in history had ever done. She was going to perform surgery on a Bloodfang. The first challenge was the chitin armor, because she could not access the wound properly without moving the plates, and she did not know how the plates connected or how sensitive they were. She reached out and touched the edge of one plate with her fingertips, and the Bloodfang flinched beneath her touch, and a sound like distant thunder rolled through its chest. "I'm sorry," Elena said, pulling her hand back. "I know that hurts, but I need to move this plate to reach the wound. Can you help me understand how to do that without causing more damage?" The Bloodfang was silent for a long moment, and then it did something that made Elena's heart stop. It spoke. The sound that came from its throat was rough and broken and filled with static, like a machine that had not been used in centuries. And the words were strange and fragmented, but they were words. "Lift," the creature said. "Edge. Toward. Spine. Lift." Elena stared at the Bloodfang with wide eyes, and for a moment she forgot about the wound and the danger and the fact that she was kneeling next to the galaxy's most feared predator. "You can talk," she whispered. The creature made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough, and its eyes seemed to dim slightly. "Long time," it said. Since speaking, long time since need. Elena felt tears building in her eyes, and she did not know if they were tears of fear or tears of wonder. But she blinked them away and focused on the task in front of her. She followed the creature's instructions and lifted the edge of the chitin plate toward its spine. And the plate shifted aside to reveal the wound beneath. And Elena got her first look at Bloodfang biology. The muscle was dense and dark red, almost black, and it was wrapped around a framework of bone that looked like metal. And there were veins of glowing crimson that pulsed with every heartbeat. And the whole thing was more beautiful and more terrifying than anything she had ever seen. She worked for hours, removing the metal shard piece by piece, sealing the torn vessels with laser sutures, stitching the muscle back together with thread that was designed for human flesh, but seemed to work just as well on Bloodfang tissue. The creature watched her the whole time, and sometimes it made sounds of pain, and sometimes it made sounds that might have been questions, and Elena talked to it constantly, explaining what she was doing and why she was doing it at some point during the night. One of the Kalari miners crawled out of the shelter and brought Elena water, and then medical supplies, and then a blanket to keep her warm. By the time the sun rose over the highlands of Karo 7, the wound was closed, and the Bloodfang was still alive. Elena sat back on her heels and looked at her work. And her hands were covered in dark ichor, and her body was exhausted beyond anything she had ever felt. And she realized that she had just done something impossible. She had saved the monster. The Bloodfang turned its massive head toward her, and its crimson eyes were softer now, less like burning stars and more like embers. And when it spoke, its voice was clearer than before. Why? It asked. The single word hanging in the cold morning air. Elena thought about the question for a long moment, and she thought about all the reasons she could give, all the explanations that might make sense to a creature that had spent centuries being hunted and feared. But in the end, she gave the only answer that was true. Because you were hurt, she said. And I am a doctor, and doctors help things that are hurt. Even when those things are scary, even when everyone tells them not to. The Bloodfang was silent, and then it made a sound that was almost gentle, almost warm, almost like something that had forgotten how to hope, remembering what hope felt like. Mercy, it said. As if tasting the word for the first time, Elena nodded and wiped the ichor from her hands. Yes, she said, we call it mercy. The fog lifted slowly over the highlands of Karo 7, and Elena sat beside the Bloodfang as the world turned from gray to gold. And for the first time since she had arrived at the crash site, she allowed herself to breathe. The creature was resting now. Its massive form sprawled across the rocky ground, its crimson eyes half closed, but still watching her with something that might have been curiosity or might have been suspicion. The three Kalari miners had emerged from their shelter and were standing at a distance, staring at Elena and the creature with expressions that shifted between terror and amazement every few seconds. Tessith, the young engineer who had brought Elena water during the surgery, was the first to speak. I do not understand, she said, her voice trembling. I do not understand how you did this. How you sat next to it for hours. How you touched it without dying. Elena looked at her hands, still stained with dark ichor, and she thought about the question. I grew up on Earth, she said. And Earth is not a gentle place. It is full of predators and poisons and things that want to kill you. And humans learned a long time ago that running is not always the answer. Tessith shook her head, her pale blue skin flushing with emotion. But this is the Bloodfang. This is not some animal from your death world. This is the creature that destroyed Thiessen Prime. The creature that hunted the Vorn through 3 star systems. The creature that... I know the stories, Elena said softly. But stories are not the same as truth. And I think we have been telling ourselves the wrong story about the Bloodfang for a very long time. The creature stirred at the sound of its name. and its eyes opened fully, and its voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Stories," it said. The word heavy was something that sounded like sadness. "Yes, many stories, most wrong, some true. Hard to know which." Tessith made a sound of pure shock and stumbled backward. And the other two Kalari grabbed each other in fear. And Elena held up her hands to calm everyone. "It can speak," Elena explained. "I discovered that during the surgery. Its species is sentient. It has language. It has thoughts. It has feelings." "Impossible," one of the other Kalari whispered. "The Bloodfang is a beast, a monster. The scientific consensus is clear." "The scientific consensus was wrong," Elena said, and there was no anger in her voice. Only a kind of tired wonder. "We were all wrong. And we have been wrong for 400 years. The Bloodfang pushed itself up slightly, and everyone except Elena flinched at the movement, and the creature made a sound that might have been a sigh. "Not blame you," it said, its voice rough but growing clearer with use. "We gave you reason to fear, we killed, we destroyed, we were what you made us." Elena frowned at that last phrase and turned to face the creature fully. "What do you mean?" "What we made you." The Bloodfang was quiet for a long moment, and its crimson eyes seemed to dim with memory. And when it spoke again, its voice was heavy with centuries of pain. "Long ago," it began, "before your species walked among stars, before most species. New stars could be walked. We were different. We were builders. We were makers. We were peaceful." Elena listened in silence. And slowly, carefully, the other Kalari crept closer, drawn by a curiosity that was stronger than their fear. "Our world was beautiful," the Bloodfang continued. "We built cities in the clouds, and we sang songs that could be heard across continents. And we believed that the universe was full of friends we had not met yet." "What happened?" Elena asked. Though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "We met them," the Bloodfang said, and its voice turned cold and hard. "The Vorn, the Kalari, the Mythene, the others. They came to our world with ships full of weapons, and they looked at us and saw monsters. And they decided that monsters must be destroyed." Tessith made a small sound of protest, but she did not speak, and the Bloodfang continued. "They burned our cities, and they killed our children, and they hunted us across the stars. And we tried to surrender. We tried to explain. We tried to show them that we meant no harm, but they would not listen. They could not hear us past their fear." The creature's claws dug into the stone, and sparks flew, and its eyes blazed brighter red. "So we became what they believed we were. We became the monsters they wanted us to be, because if they were going to kill us anyway, then we would make them remember the cost." Silence fell over the crash site, and Elena felt tears running down her face. And she did not wipe them away. "How many of you are left?" she asked. "I do not know," the Bloodfang admitted. "I have not seen another of my kind in many rotations, many cycles. The word escapes me." "Centuries," Elena said. "Yes, centuries. I have been alone for centuries. Hunting and being hunted. Killing and being killed. And I had forgotten. I had forgotten what it was like to be seen as anything other than a monster." Elena reached out slowly and placed her hand on the creature's armored foreleg. And the Bloodfang flinched at the contact but did not pull away. "I see you," Elena said. "I see you, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what they did to your people. For what they made you become." The creature made a sound that Elena had never heard before. A low, keening noise that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest. And she realized with a start that the Bloodfang was crying. "Why?" it asked again. The same question it had asked before, but this time with a different weight. "Why do you care? Why does a human care about a Bloodfang?" Elena thought about the question carefully before she answered. "Because I believe that every living thing deserves a chance," she said. I believe that the universe is too big and too strange for us to decide who is a monster and who is not. I believe that we are all capable of terrible things, but we are also all capable of change. She looked at the Kalari miners, who were watching her with wide eyes, and she looked at the Bloodfang, who was watching her with something that looked like hope. On Earth, there were wolves, she said, predators, killers. The humans feared them and hunted them for thousands of years, and we nearly drove them to extinction. But then something changed. We learned to understand them. We learned to live beside them. And now some humans keep wolves as companions and protectors. You did not destroy them, the Bloodfang said. And there was wonder in its voice. No, Ella said. We learned that fear does not have to end in destruction. We learned that there is another way. The Bloodfang lowered its massive head until its face was close to Lillian's, and its crimson eyes studied her with an intensity that made her heart race. What is your name? It asked. Small, fierce one who sits beside monsters and stitches their flesh. Elena, she said. My name is Elena Vance. Elena, the creature repeated. And the way it said her name made it sound like something sacred. I will remember this name. I will remember this night. I will remember that a human taught me a word I had forgotten. What word? Elena asked. Hope, the Bloodfang said. The word is hope. Above them, the fog cleared completely, and the stars of the Karo system blazed down on the crash site. And somewhere in the distance, a rescue ship was finally approaching. Elena did not know what would happen when the ship arrived. She did not know how the galaxy would react to what she had done. She did not know if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life or the most important decision in galactic history. But she knew one thing for certain: she was not sorry, and she would not take it back, and whatever came next, she would face it the same way she had faced everything else, one patient at a time. The tribunal chamber was the largest room Elena had ever seen, and it was filled with representatives from 40 different species. And every single one of them was staring at her with expressions that ranged from disgust to confusion to outright hatred. She stood alone at the center of the room, wearing the same clothes she had worn on Karo 7, still stained with traces of dark ichor that she had not been able to wash out completely. The news of what she had done had spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and the reactions had been exactly as violent as she had expected. The Voran Confederacy had demanded her immediate execution, calling her actions a betrayal of every sentient species in the Galactic Union. And the Kalari Assembly had called for her permanent exile to the Outer Rim. And the Methane religious councils had split into factions that either wanted to worship her as a prophet or burn her as a heretic. The human diplomatic corps had tried to distance themselves from her, issuing statements that described her actions as the independent choices of one individual and not representative of humanity as a whole. Elena had not expected them to defend her, and she did not blame them for trying to protect their species from the political fallout. But she also did not regret what she had done, and she was not going to apologize. The High Arbiter of the Galactic Tribunal, an ancient Vorn with scars covering most of his visible skin, raised one of his forearms to silence the murmuring crowd. Dr. Elena Vance of Earth, he said, his voice echoing through the massive chamber. You stand accused of providing aid and comfort to an enemy of the Galactic Union, specifically the creature known as the Bloodfang. Do you deny this accusation? Elena took a deep breath and looked directly at the Arbiter. No, she said. I do not deny it. I found an injured creature, and I treated its wounds. That is what happened. The crowd erupted in angry shouts and cries of outrage, and the Arbiter had to call for silence 3 times before the noise died down. You admit that you saved the life of a creature that has killed millions, the Arbiter said. A creature that has destroyed entire civilizations. A creature that every species in this union has sworn to destroy on sight. I admit that I saved the life of a sentient being who was in pain, Elena replied, and her voice was calm and steady. I am a doctor, and that is what doctors do. It is a monster, someone shouted from the crowd. A beast without thought or reason. Elena turned toward the voice, and she felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. No, she said. It is not. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small data chip, and she held it up for everyone to see before I was brought here. I spent 3 days with the Bloodfang, and during that time I recorded everything. I recorded its vital signs. I recorded its brain activity. I recorded its attempts to communicate with me. She walked toward the central display console, and the guards moved to stop her. But the Arbiter waved them back with a gesture. What is on that chip? The Arbiter asked. The truth, Elena said. And she inserted the chip into the console. The holographic display flickered to life. And suddenly the tribunal chamber was filled with images and sounds from Caro 7. And every representative in the room watched in stunned silence as the Bloodfang spoke. They heard its rough and broken voice describing the destruction of its world. And they saw the neural scans that showed activity patterns consistent with sentience. And they listened as the creature told stories about cities in the clouds and songs that could be heard across continents. When the recording ended, the chamber was completely silent. Elena let the silence stretch for a long moment before she spoke again. 400 years ago, our ancestors encountered a species they did not understand. And because they did not understand it, they feared it. And because they feared it, they tried to destroy it. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every representative she could see. We burned their world. We killed their children. We hunted them across the stars. And when they tried to surrender, we would not listen. And when they tried to explain, we could not hear. And so they became the monsters we believed them to be. Her voice grew harder, sharper. We created the Bloodfang, all of us, every species in this room. We took a peaceful civilization and we turned them into the nightmare we were afraid of. And then we spent 400 years congratulating ourselves for being brave enough to fight the monsters we made. That is enough, the Arbiter said, his voice trembling with something that might have been anger or might have been shame. You have made your point, Dr. Vance. But the fact remains that the Bloodfang has killed. Because we gave it no choice, Elena interrupted. Because we made it impossible for it to be anything else. She turned back to face the Arbiter directly. I'm not saying that the Bloodfang is innocent. I'm not saying that it has not done terrible things. I am saying that we bear responsibility for those terrible things. And I am saying that if we are truly the civilized species we claim to be, then we have an obligation to try a different approach. And what approach would that be? The Arbiter demanded before Elena could answer. The doors of the tribunal chamber crashed open, and every being in the room turned to look. And every being in the room felt their blood run cold. The Bloodfang walked into the chamber. It had followed Elena across half the quadrant, tracking her ship through routes that should have been impossible to navigate. And now it stood at the entrance of the tribunal chamber, its crimson eyes glowing softly, its massive form filling the doorway like a shadow come to life. The guards raised their weapons, and the representatives scrambled for cover, and screams echoed off the walls. But the Bloodfang did not attack. It walked slowly toward the center of the room, each step deliberate and careful, and it stopped beside Elena and lowered its massive head. I speak, it said, its voice filling the chamber. I speak for my people, for what remains of them, for what you tried to destroy. The Arbiter stared at the creature with wide eyes, his forearms trembling. You speak, he whispered. You have language. You have thought. We always did, the Bloodfang said. You never listened. It turned to look at the assembled representatives, and its gaze was heavy with centuries of pain and rage and something that might have been forgiveness. "This one," it said, gesturing toward Elena with one massive claw. "This human, she did what none of you would do. She sat beside a monster, and she saw a person. She gave mercy when mercy was not earned. She gave hope when hope was forgotten." The creature's voice grew softer, almost gentle. "We do not ask for forgiveness. We know what we have done. We know the blood on our claws. But we ask for a chance to be something other than what you made us. A chance to remember who we were before the burning." Silence filled the chamber once more, and Elena felt something wet on her cheeks. And she realized she was crying. The Arbiter was quiet for a long time. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, more uncertain. "What would you have us do?" he asked. The Bloodfang looked at Elena, and its eyes seemed to brighten. "Learn," it said. "Learn a word that this human taught me, a word I had forgotten, a word that might save us all." "What word?" the Arbiter asked. The Bloodfang turned back to face the tribunal, and when it spoke, the words seemed to hang in the air like something fragile and precious and infinitely powerful: mercy. 3 years had passed since the tribunal, and the galaxy was slowly learning to change. Elena stood on the bridge of the survey vessel Prometheus, watching stars blur into streaks of light as the ship jumped to faster than light speed. And beside her stood the creature that had once been the most feared being in the known universe. The Bloodfang had chosen a name for itself, the first name it had spoken in 400 years, and that name was Corveth, which meant second-born in the ancient language of its people. It had explained to Elena that in its culture, the second-born was the child that came after great loss, the child that represented hope for the future. And Elena had cried when she heard this, because she understood what it meant for the creature to choose such a name. The tribunal had not reached a consensus on Elena's fate or on the fate of the Bloodfang species. But it had not mattered, because what she had done could not be undone, and what she had revealed could not be hidden. The recording from Karos 7 had spread across every world in the Galactic Union, and trillions of beings had watched the Bloodfang speak about the destruction of its civilization. And something had shifted in the collective consciousness of the galaxy. Not everyone had changed their minds, and many still called for the destruction of every Bloodfang in existence. And some still called for Elena's execution, but others had begun asking questions. A Kalari research team had made contact with another Bloodfang on a distant world. And instead of attacking on sight, they had tried to communicate, and they had succeeded. And now there were 2 Bloodfangs in contact with the Galactic Union instead of one. A Mythian philosopher had published a treatise called The Mercy Doctrine, arguing that the Union's treatment of the Bloodfang species represented a moral failure of galactic proportions. And the treatise had become the most widely read document in 300 years human. Xenobiologists had flooded into the Outer Rim, seeking to understand rather than destroy, and they had discovered that there were other species that the Union had feared and hunted, other civilizations that might be more than the monsters they appeared to be. The galaxy was waking up, slowly and painfully, to the possibility that it had been wrong about many things. Elena had been offered a position as the first human Bloodfang liaison, and she had accepted without hesitation. And her first assignment was one that she had requested herself. She was going to find the Bloodfang homeworld, the ancient. Records said that the world had been destroyed by orbital bombardment 3 centuries ago. But Corveth believed that some of its people might have survived, hiding in the ruins of their cities, waiting for the hunters to give up and go away. The journey would take months, and there was no guarantee that they would find anything. But Elena had learned that hope did not require guarantees. She turned to look at Corveth, and the creature looked back at her. And there was something in its crimson eyes that she had never seen there before: contentment. "Do you think we will find them?" she asked. Corveth was silent for a moment, And then it made the sound that Elena had come to recognize as its version of a shrug. "I do not know," it said. "But for the first time in many centuries, I believe it is possible. And that is more than I have had in a very long time." Elena smiled and turned back to the view screen, and the stars continued to blur past them. And somewhere ahead of them was a world that might hold the key to healing a wound 400 years old. A young Vorn ensign approached them nervously, his forearms clutched close to his body. And Elena recognized the fear in his eyes, because she had seen it in the eyes of every species that encountered Corveth for the first time. But she also saw something else in his eyes. Something that made her heart swell with hope, curiosity. "Dr. Vance," the ensign said, his voice trembling only slightly. "I have read the reports from Karo 7, and I have watched the tribunal recordings. And I wanted to ask you a question, if that is permitted." "Of course," Elena said. "Ask anything you want." The ensign glanced at Gorveth and then quickly looked away. And his voice dropped to a whisper. "How were you not afraid? How did you sit next to it that first night and not run away?" Elena thought about the question for a long moment. And she remembered the fog and the cold and the sound of the Bloodfang breathing. And she remembered the terror that had gripped her heart when she first saw the creature watching her with those burning crimson eyes. "I was terrified," she admitted. "I was more afraid than I had ever been in my entire life." The ensign looked confused. "But you did not run," he said. "You stayed. You helped. You showed mercy." Elena nodded slowly. "Fear is just a feeling," she said. "It is a warning from your brain that tells you something might be dangerous. But it is not the same as cruelty, and it is not the same as hate. And it does not have to control what you do next." She reached out and placed her hand on the ensign's shoulder. And she felt him flinch at the contact but not pull away. "I decided a long time ago which one I was going to let control me. And when I saw Corveth lying there injured and alone, I realized that fear would have made me run, but mercy asked me to stay. And I chose mercy." The ensign was quiet for a moment. And then he did something that made Elena's heart swell with pride. He turned to face Corveth directly, and he bowed his head in the Vorn gesture of respect. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what my ancestors did to your people. For what we made you become, I am sorry." Corveth rumbled softly, and the sound was warm and gentle. And when it spoke, its voice was filled with something that sounded almost like hope. "Apology accepted," it said. "Little Vorn who asks questions, you are brave, braver than many. I will remember you." The ensign bowed again and retreated to his station, and Elena watched him go. And she felt tears building in her eyes once more. "They are changing," she said softly. "The galaxy is changing." Corveth moved to stand beside her, and its massive form cast a shadow across the bridge. But no one flinched anymore, and no one screamed. "Yes," Corveth agreed. "Slowly, painfully, but changing. And it is because of you, Elena Vance. Because you sat beside a monster and saw something else." "I did not do anything special," Elena said. "I just did what any doctor would do." Corveth made the sound that Elena had come to recognize as laughter. A deep rumbling that vibrated through the deck plates. "No," it said. "You did what a human would do, and that is something special indeed. Your species looks at monsters and sees family. Your species looks at enemies and sees friends. Your species looks at fear and chooses mercy." The creature turned its massive head to look at Elena, and its crimson eyes were soft and warm. "Humans," it said, and there was wonder in its voice. "Strange, small, fierce ones, you will change the galaxy. You are already changing it, and I am grateful that I lived long enough to see it happen." Elena did not know what to say, so she said nothing, and they stood together in silence as the stars streamed past them behind them. The crew of the Prometheus continued their work. Vorn and Kaleri and Mythene and Human all working side by side, all looking forward to a future that had seemed impossible just 3 years ago, and somewhere out there, in the depths of space, on a world that had been burned and broken and left for dead, the last survivors of an ancient civilization might be waiting for someone to find them. Elena did not know if they would succeed in their mission, and she did not know what the future would bring. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The galaxy had learned a new word, and that word was mercy, and nothing would ever be the same again. She looked up at Corveth, and the creature looked down at her, and something passed between them that did not need words. They were not human and monster. They were not doctor and patient. They were not even friends in the traditional sense of the word. They were something new. Something that had never existed before. Something that the galaxy was only just beginning to understand. They were proof that fear did not have to win. That cruelty did not have to triumph. That the universe was full of second chances for those brave enough to reach for them. And as the Prometheus raced through the stars, toward an uncertain future, Elena Vance and Corveth stood together on the bridge, a human and a Bloodfang, watching the dawn of a new era. The galaxy had feared the Bloodfang for centuries, but a human had sat beside it and stitched its flesh, and in that simple act of mercy, everything had changed. Everything was still changing, and it was beautiful.